Hello, the purpose of this video is to make up for an omission on my part. At the beginning of September 2025 I published my usual deep dive article, and in it I effectively collected together material I'd prepared before that would help you undertake a comprehensive review of your portfolio, and I explained the process of maintenance and review and so on. When I reread the longest and most thorough article on the subject, I saw that it concluded by saying, as I'd produced a lot of material, I was not going to go further and bore you to tears with looking at performance analysis for individual funds, and that I'd publish another article about that. And as far as I can tell, I never did so. So this video is to make up for that. We're going to look at how you might assess the performance of a fund you're not altogether comfortable with. Your data collection has shown it slipping down the quartile rankings, or the absolute numbers in terms of percentage return relative to other parts of your portfolio are looking too low, not where you'd expect them to be. And I'm going to do this using two actual funds. Those funds, because of where we are in the market in September 2025, will be European funds, because this is a market where I think there's lots of potential as the world falls out of love with Trump's America. But as yet, most of that is still latent, and so not all the funds are showing decent performance yet. Some are, but it's still a mixed picture, and therefore great for doing comparisons. And I'm going to show you a method of scoring funds on the basis of what I think are relevant facts that are easy to put together. That scoring method won't necessarily allow you to make decisions, but at least it'll put some structure into the comparison process. So I'm going to zoom in on the screen so you can see the table I constructed, and you won't see me anymore, and then we'll get going. Hopefully that's clear and the autofocus is working. I can't tell from this distance. I obviously will check before the video is published. The left-hand column is facts. These are the facts we're going to collect, and I've limited it to about 10. You could collect more. Then we're going to have those facts for the review fund, and we're going to score them out of 10. This will be a bit subjective, but you'll understand the process. Then we're going to look at an alternative fund. Now, the alternative fund could be a fund we already own, could be a fund in the same sector, it could be a different fund that we think is more appropriate in the current market, allowing for the global macro picture, or it could be something we've just discovered in research or is perhaps recommended by II in one of their pick lists, and therefore is essentially a benchmark against which we compare the performance of the fund we already own. The first fund is actually the Schroeder European Recovery Z. That's the unit class. And the first piece of data we're going to look at is performance in terms of quartile rankings over 1, 3, 5 years. So that's the 1, 3 and 5 year quartiles. And the numbers in this case are 3, that's 1 year, 2 and 2. So the performance has slipped off a bit from being above average. What do you think that scores out of 10? I think it's still a decent fund, but it's not doing brilliantly, so I gave that 6. The alternative fund here happens to be one in the same sector, as we will see. This is the M&G Sustainable Funds range, Paris-aligned European variant, and that also has, fun enough, the same quartile rankings, so we've got to be fair and give it 6. Quartile rankings are interesting in that you like all your funds to be first quartile all the time, but sometimes a fund that is very well run will not be first quartile temporarily because the market is moving in a way that the fund manager is not comfortable with, and he won't follow it, and his contrarian position may well drop him down the quartile rankings. Interestingly, Schroders are known for being a contrarian value manager. Let's look at a measure of risk. Risk and return always need looking at together. So we'll look at volatility, and we use the standard deviation. Volatility. And the standard deviation for the Schroeder fund is 14.43. That's the 3 year standard deviation, and for the M&G fund it's 11.49. Now that I think is high, and in fact you can get an assessment of the risk from Morningstar's data, and I'm using Morningstar and TrustNet as my data sources here. So I think that's not too good, that's higher than we'd like, so I'll give that 4. And I think the M&G one is where you might expect it to be, so we'll give that 7. Then we're going to look at who the manager is. I always think people are important. Morningstar agree with me, they have a people tab, and we need to know how long the manager's been in post. Change of manager can often explain a change of performance, probably not in the first 6 months to a year, but certainly in performance over perhaps a whole year, maybe 2 years, 3 years. In this case, this manager, a chap called Andrew Liddon, I'll put his name in abbreviation just to make things a little speedier, and he's been in post since 2018, and I think that's a reasonably long time, so let's 6 years, let's give that 8 points. The M&G manager is a chap called John Olsen, and I think the Olsen does indicate he's Scandinavian, largely because there's a lot of Danish stock in this fund, and he's been there since 2014, so that's a little bit better, so let's give him 9 points. No change recently, not enough to explain the quartile performance changes because they've both been in post for 1, 3 and 5 years. The asset class, relevant to know this if we're comparing different funds, because you can't compare apples, pears and bananas and so on. In fact, they're both Europe ex UK, so they're both in the same sector. So those performance numbers are from the same peer group. And I'm just going to put ditto there. Fund flows. This is a piece of data that perhaps I haven't talked about with people before because it's newly available on the improved Morningstar fact sheets. You can see a histogram of fund flows in and out of a fund on the summary page. That's really interesting because it indicates how the market as a whole, how advisors generally are treating the fund in terms of whether they're putting money in or out. Now, I'm afraid to say that classically advisors will sell a fund when its performance numbers go down, irrespective of the fact. They might well be able to make a case if they thought about it for topping a fund up and buying more. But nonetheless, momentum is important, and perhaps if a fund has outflows for too long, it becomes more risky simply because the fund manager may have to sell its best stocks to pay back investors, and indeed the fund may get too small for him to earn an adequate bonus, or he may even be made redundant. So fund flows are an interesting fact. Now, for Schroders, year to date, fund flows are in, but for several years before that they were out. So it seems like the market thinks Schroders are well positioned for the way the world is at the moment. Unfortunately, on the M&G fund, there's very little data, I suspect because it's largely owned institutionally, and as a result, things are very stable. So I think I can give Schroders 7 points for having positive fund flows in. And M&G, we haven't got any data, so I'll just have to give it a middling 5. Next piece of data I'm going to look at is the style. This is extremely important when you're trying to compare the fund with the market. If the market loves growth stocks, as it has done for a long time in the USA, a value fund may underperform. But on the other hand, if we come to the end of the growth cycle and the P/E ratios for growth funds are really high, there's no valuation to be found, money might be beginning to flow into cheaper value stocks where effectively there are profits being made and some defensive characteristics look attractive. So what do we find out? We can find this out, of course, from looking in the Morningstar data. This is a mid-cap value fund. Market capitalisation is also relevant, of course. And the M&G fund is a large cap growth fund, but with a little bit of a hint to value, so I call it large cap blend towards growth. Now, I'm not going to give a score for that because that's just information. Top 10 holdings, always interesting. So anything of interest there that tells us about how the manager is currently working and whether he's changed the holdings. Because remember, when you look at the top 10 holdings in the Morningstar data, you can see how long the manager's held those stocks. Now, the Schroeder Fund has a very mixed in terms of sectors, and there is some recent rotation, in other words, some change in those holdings. The M&G fund is also diverse, but it holds less stocks and there is less rotation. So I think on this, Schroders wins. So I'm going to give Schroders 8 points, and I'm going to give M&G 7 points. The remaining space I put for observations. Now this is perhaps where experience and skill become relevant. What can I tell by looking at the totality of the data and possibly doing some external research looking for video presentations by Googling the fund name or the fund manager's name, and the other data that we haven't talked about, which we could tabulate, but for the sake of simplicity I'm just going to cover in the general observations. So this fund is very low on tech, well underweight. That's the Schroeder fund. Now, as it's a deep value fund, I already explained that, that's not surprising, is it? Because tech stocks are classically going to be companies that are supposed to be making their money in the future or are making lots of money based on really rapid growth, the Nvidias and ASMLs and so on of this world. And the stocks are going to be on extremely high PEs and potentially subject to a large setback if the market collapses. This fund is, on the other hand, overweight energy and consumer, which strikes me as a bit odd. European consumer is not in that strong a position. European economies are generally growing very slowly, and of course the effect of Trump's tariffs might be seriously negative. I believe the market is absorbing that fact at the moment. So that's not altogether positive. I think there's some positives and some negatives. So I think that warrants a neutral 5. The M&G fund is overweight communications and industrials. Now, what does that mean? What are we talking about there? Well, we're talking about businesses that I think might well benefit, indeed benefit handsomely, from extra defence spending in Europe, which is the main driver for the future. Very, very large amounts of money are going to be spent on not just defence manufacturing, shells and tanks and aeroplanes, but defence infrastructure, and comms is obviously a large part of that. So the positioning of the M&G fund strikes me as being more appropriate to the situation we're in at the moment. So I'm going to give that a fairly healthy 8. I quite liked that. That's information I've collected so far. For purposes of this exercise, that's enough to give us a score. So what have we got? 10, 18, 25, 33, 38. Just cross-check that. 10, 18, 25, 30, 38. And here we've got 15, 24, 29, 36, 44. So if you own both these funds, I think, and in fact I do, you'd be thinking that as we are now, at this point in time, the M&G fund is better positioned, and if I was adding new money, I would add it to that. Would I sell the Schroeder fund? Well, firstly, I'd want to know whether it was sufficiently diversified from the M&G fund to either substitute one for the other or to keep both. So I ran a fund comparison using the TrustNet tool, which you're probably all familiar with, and I concluded that the correlation was relatively low for funds in the same sector at 0.78. I also pulled off the TrustNet comparison data and noted that the number of positive periods for the M&G fund out of the last 36 was 23 and the number of negative periods was 13. And here Schroders has the edge, 25 positive periods against 11 negative. A ratio of about 2 to 1 is pretty common when looking at markets in the last decade, which broadly speaking been rising in fact since 2008. There have been dips, but most funds have made money handsomely since 2008. So you're looking at numbers around 24 to 12. So Schroders beat that, M&G underperformed slightly. Looking at the graph, which you won't be able to see here, it's quite clear that the M&G fund has outperformed significantly, but only in the last 3 months. Why that is, I'm not altogether sure. It's clearly to do with the specific holdings, and I don't think that sort of change in data is likely to be sustained. Over the last 12 months, the funds more or less moved in the same direction at the same time. But interestingly, in that particular period, rather than the 3-year period where we have a standard deviation number, the M&G fund was more volatile than the Schroder fund. So, can we make a decision as to whether we've got a good or bad fund here? The answer is no, we can't. I could have chosen a more clear-cut case for purposes of education. In other words, I could have fixed this presentation, but actually, as is usually my habit, I've kept it realistic based on real funds that people might actually be owning and that I am familiar with in some detail. So this slippage from second to third quartile is for me something that is an orange light, requires us to pay attention. We have paid attention. It's not a flashing red sell signal, and I think my overall high-level philosophy is if you have information that is not sufficient to give you clear reasons for making a decision, it is better to make no decision at all and allow the status quo to continue, and then perhaps come back to the very same question at your next review in 6 months' time, or if you're really concerned, maybe put in a special review at 3 months' time. Or bear it in mind, when you're doing research, if you bump into a European fund that looks particularly good, run a comparison against the fund you own and see if a substitution is appropriate. Any questions, as always, please email me, deal within our periodic phone calls if we're having those, or make a comment on the website. So thanks for your attention, hope that's useful.